never take in refugees. We don't even know who these people are.
Lots of Americans agree with Donald Trump. A Gallup poll found most oppose the plan to bring 10,000 refugees here from Syria. Mark Krikorian says we should oppose that. Mark runs the Center for Immigration Studies, which wants less immigration. David Bier researches immigration policy at the Libertarianist Cannon Center. He says we should take in more than the 10,000 Syrians. More? What? They might want to kill me.
We've brought over 3 million refugees to the United States since 1980, and not a single one has committed an act of terrorism in the United States. Look, if we're going to win
this guy in San Bernardino wasn't a refugee, but he
was an American citizen, actually. And so, the point is that we can do vetting, we can bring people over, but the important thing is that the risk of terrorism is so incredibly small that if we're going to abandon our moral values for this, the threat needs to be significant. And it's more likely that you're going to be struck by lightning than killed by a terrorist in the United States.
So far, though. But if we bring in all these people, well, Mark, I'll give you your shot.
Well, we're not letting lightning strikes in based on government policy. This is completely optional policy. Well, let's even get before the terrorism issue with regard to refugee resettlement. It costs 12 times as much to resettle one refugee in the United States as it does to help him, provide for him in the region, in Turkey or Jordan or Lebanon.
Well, we have a graph on that. The 5-year cost of resettling one refugee, $64,000. The UN's cost, if they're behind barbed wire in some...
They're in refugee camps. They're not imprisoned.
$5,000.
Right. And so
leave them there. Keep them there.
Because, number one, it keeps whatever security issues there are, it keeps offshore. But in a humanitarian sense, we're helping far more people. Money is not infinite.
David, what about that?
So much money.
Leave them in the Middle East.
With all due respect to Mark's study, it's a complete joke. He divides the amount of money we give to the UN by the 4 million refugees. But the vast majority of the refugees aren't in refugee camps. The number is bogus. And if you look at the number on the American side,
it's always interesting when they say, with all due respect.
The fiscal costs of the refugee to the American economy, he completely ignores the economic benefits of the refugees to the American communities.
A lot of them come here and pay taxes and invent things.
They start businesses. If you go to St. Louis and Cleveland and other areas around the country, you'll see the positive economic contributions that they're contributing. And he completely ignores
Steve Jobs' dad came here from Syria, from Syria.
It's nothing to do with refugees. It was his sperm donor, as Steve Jobs himself said.
Well, they might have been a refugee.
He was a millionaire crony of the dictator of Syria. It has nothing to do with it. And 90% of Middle Eastern refugees, according to the government, are on Medicaid. We have this setup where poorly educated, traumatized people are ushered into welfare dependency. That's not good for them, but also, and this is the key point, look, what we're saying is that we're seeing 12 people floundering in the water. We're sending a one-person yacht to pick one of them up rather than throwing all 12 of them a life vest. And that is a moral question.
Look, again, his study is bogus. Syrian Americans actually make, on average, more than the native-born American. And so it's just incorrect
over time, the Muslim immigrants
they assimilate and they actually outperform the average American. So
a huge
wrong.
A huge share of Syrians are actually Christian. They're not even Arab, the ones who are in the United States. They did not come. There's only a handful of people who've been admitted as refugees.
Before World War II, America didn't want Jewish refugees. Other groups have been.
Were there Jewish terrorist groups shooting up people in Paris? Were there Jewish supremacist groups trying to take over the world? No, there weren't. In fact, it's an insult. It's an insult to compare. It is an insult to compare Jewish refugees fleeing Nazism to
Muslims aren't
Islamist
supremacist refugees.
Aren't less likely to mix with our culture?
This is the exact same thing they said about Catholic immigrants, Jewish immigrants. Every single immigrant wave, they said the exact same thing. The Catholics are subservient to the Pope, and they were wrong then and they're wrong now about the Muslim immigrants.
There are 60 million refugees are internally displaced people in the world.
So we should take
We're
some.
not going to take anything but the tiniest fraction if we do refugee
Better than
resettlement.
nothing.
No, why? No, it isn't. Because what it is basically a handful of people winning the lottery, and we're spending a disproportionate sum of money in caring for those folks instead of leveraging that money that we spend on refugee protection to help people where they are, meaning they're much more likely to go home when the conflict ends there. They're staying in places that are more familiar to them.
It's a false choice. The U.S. government has no moral obligation to support refugees, whether here or abroad.
Sure.
What it does have a moral obligation to do is get out of the way of people fleeing violence and persecution abroad. That's why we've suggested that we allow private organizations to fund the resettlement, something that the government does not currently allow, but used to.
If I say I want to take a refugee, I'm paying for him. He won't be on welfare.
Exactly.
That's not legal now.
It's not legal
No.
now, but it used to be. Ronald Reagan proposed a program in the 1980s, and Canada does it as well.
Let Mark answer.
So change the Refugee Act, get the president to sign it, and come back to me when you do that.
Mark,
frankly, to say that we should get rid of welfare and that will solve the problem is like saying if there was less gravity, I could jump higher. It's not the real world.
Hang on a second. Mark, are you in agreement with what these two presidential candidates say about refugees?
If there's a rabid dog running around in your neighborhood, you're probably not going to assume something good about that dog, and you're probably going to put your children out of the way.
If you bought a 5-pound bag of peanuts and you knew that in the 5-pound bag of peanuts there were about 10 peanuts that were deadly poisonous, would you feed them to your kids? The answer is no.
The deal I'll make with Dr. Carson is I won't do brain surgery if he stays out of politics.
Well, do you agree with him?
No, of course not. I mean, well, I don't know. I'm not even sure what his analogy was.
I mean, the reality is that we have the largest humanitarian crisis since World War II, and the United States is banning 99.8% of all refugees from coming over to the United States. The least we could do is allow American citizens to cover the cost of resettlement, which is something that other countries have done and would do a world of good for people and the United States.
Thank you, David Bier, Mark Krikorian.